The wind howled through the ruins of Frankfurt. It was February 1946, and the city lay silent, its bones of brick and ash jutting against a pale German sky. Snow drifted over collapsed roofs and shattered tram lines. In the middle of what had once been a bustling boulevard, a small boy no older than 8 stood barefoot, clutching a dented tin cup. His coat hung from him like paper. His eyes, gray and hollow, watched the slow approach of an American Army truck. Its tires crunched over glass. The GIs inside had seen this before, dozens of children scavenging, always hungry, always silent. But something about this boy made one of them tap the driver's shoulder and say, "Stop." He didn't know it then, but that decision would begin one of the most unexpected chapters of the post-war world, the quiet, forbidden story of American soldiers adopting the very children left behind by their enemy. Germany in 1945 was not merely defeated, it was dismembered. 12 million homes lay in rubble. 10 million civilians roamed the roads as refugees. Among them were more than 3 million orphans, sons and daughters of soldiers who'd never returned, of mothers buried under bombardment, of civilians erased by hunger and chaos. The Allied victory had come at a cost not measured in battle reports, an entire generation of children without a nation. The Allied authorities called them DP minors, displaced persons too young to speak for themselves. They were everywhere, sleeping in train stations, wandering in packs through forests, living in basements among rats and ASHTO, the American occupation forces arriving in Bavaria, Hesse, and the Rhineland. These children were both a humanitarian problem and a haunting mirror. They had come to rebuild peace, yet each child's eyes seemed to ask a question no victory parade could answer. What happens to the innocent when nations go mad? At first, military orders were clear. Soldiers were forbidden from forming personal attachments with local civilians, especially Germans. The official stance was strict neutrality, no gifts, no emotional entanglements, no fraternization. The word itself became a kind of curse whispered through the barracks. But war has a way of eroding regulations. When faced with hunger and small, trembling hands, even the most disciplined soldiers hesitated. Many began leaving food near ruins, quietly handing chocolate bars to children, or fixing abandoned bicycles for them. What started as acts of compassion soon grew into something deeper. In towns like Nuremberg and Stuttgart, GIs found entire groups of children living among ruins, surviving by stealing coal or scraps from army kitchens. They built fires in the shells of bombed-out apartments. Some wore armbands cut from American flag cloths they'd scavenged, symbols of hope in a shattered land. And gradually, across the occupation zones, a new and entirely unofficial phenomenon began to surface. American soldiers informally adopting German orphans. It didn't begin with paperwork. It began with trust. A soldier would bring a child food, then a blanket, then shelter in an army depot or makeshift barrack. The children learned to call these men Papa Joe or Uncle Sam. Some learned English before they remembered their own surnames. Others were too traumatized to speak at all, communicating only through gestures or drawings. In Frankfurt, a sergeant named Harold Mason found 2 siblings living in a collapsed cellar. Their parents had died in an air raid months earlier. Mason began visiting daily, bringing them bread from the mess hall. When winter deepened, he smuggled them into his quarters. He hid them under an old army cot whenever officers came through for inspection. When his unit was reassigned to Bremen, he faced a choice: leave them or defy orders. He took them with him, falsifying transport papers to list them as dependents. Mason's story was far from unique. By spring 1946, military chaplains were reporting dozens of similar cases. Soldiers wrote home describing adopted war kids, attaching photographs of smiling faces framed by army helmets several sizes too large. The letters often opened with words like, "You won't believe this," and ended with confessions of guilt and affection. Some soldiers sent their own rations home so they could afford to keep feeding the children abroad. Others petitioned U.S. embassies, begging for legal adoption rights, a process that did not yet exist for enemies of the state. Washington, it posed a moral dilemma. Publicly, the U.S. wanted to show compassion while maintaining discipline. Quietly, many officials feared scandal. Newspapers had begun printing sympathetic stories about the little children of Germany, and mothers back home were writing to the War Department asking how to help. Yet legally, adopting enemy nationals remained almost impossible. Soldiers who tried faced court-martials for breaching military conduct. Some resigned early or paid their own passage to return as civilians just to complete the process. Still, the tide could not be stopped. As Europe starved through the hunger winter of 1946, more GIs ignored orders. They built orphan shelters with their own hands, bartered cigarettes for milk, and escorted children across borders under false pretenses. Each act of defiance whispered a single truth: empathy had survived the war. Even when nations had not, there was something transformative in the way these hardened men, many fresh from the horrors of Omaha Beach or the Ardennes, found redemption in the laughter of children. They had seen destruction beyond words. Now, feeding one hungry boy felt like reclaiming a piece of humanity they'd thought was lost forever. For the children, the soldiers were not occupiers. They were giants who spoke in kindness, who carried them on shoulders through the ruins, who replaced fear with a fragile kind of hope. Yet beneath the compassion lingered a shadow. Many of these adoptions were entirely unsanctioned, recorded nowhere, and carried out in a moral gray zone between regulation and instinct. When rotations ended and soldiers were sent home, countless promises shattered overnight. Some children woke one morning to find their American father gone, his duffel bag empty, his name a fading memory. Others were smuggled aboard transport ships hidden among cargo, clutching letters that vouched for their refugee status. A few made it all the way to the United States, quietly entering a country that still bore the scars of war rationing. For the men who succeeded, the bond was unbreakable. They raised German sons and daughters in small American towns, teaching them baseball and English hymns while hiding the past from neighbors who might not understand. Some children grew up believing they were born American until decades later, old documents revealed the truth. AS occupation officials began to realize what was happening. Internal memoranda circulated in secret. Commanders debated whether to intervene or quietly allow the practice to continue. Public opinion was shifting. Photographs of soldiers holding blonde-haired children circulated through magazines, reframing the conqueror as caretaker. What had begun as forbidden fraternization was turning into a symbol of reconciliation. Still, among the ruins, not every story found such an ending. For every child saved, thousands remained lost, unnamed, unrecorded, wandering through refugee camps that smelled of kerosene and despair. Social workers tried to trace them, but records were gone, families erased. The Allied forces could rebuild bridges and factories, but no blueprint existed for rebuilding trust in a child's heart. WWII late 1946. Whispers spread among the barracks that new orders were coming. Soldiers who had risked everything to shelter their adopted children began to fear they would be forced to give them up. Rumors spoke of upcoming investigations, of deportations, of disciplinary actions. And so, one final act of defiance began taking shape, an organized attempt by certain units to conceal what they had done before the inspectors arrived. What happened next would decide the fate of hundreds of those children, and expose the U.S. Army to a moral crisis unlike anything it had faced since the war itself, in the spring of 1947. As occupation authorities tightened control over every town and depot, an unexpected resistance began, not from rebels or saboteurs, but from American soldiers themselves. The crackdown was silent, bureaucratic, and cold. The U.S. military government, concerned about rising headlines in American newspapers, ordered a comprehensive inspection of civilian fraternization violations. Any soldier found harboring orphans, they said, would face disciplinary review. What followed would expose a hidden network of compassion operating beneath the Army's own structure, a network that relied not on guns or orders, but on logistics, deception, and quiet bravery. First, the inspectors expected to find only a few isolated cases. Instead, they uncovered entire systems built to hide children from discovery. In Darmstadt, military supply officers kept false manifests listing extra dependents aboard transport convoys. In Munich, a quartermaster's unit had transformed a disused Luftwaffe hangar into an equipment repair annex. In reality, It was an orphan dormitory disguised under military code numbers. Radio operators sent coded messages between bases warning of upcoming inspections. The same men who had once coordinated artillery fire now coordinated safe houses for orphans across the American zone. Behind these quiet operations stood the engineers and clerks who made them possible. Communications specialists rigged shortwave transmitters from scrap parts to relay warnings. Truck mechanics repainted military vehicles to look like Red Cross convoys. Army medics forged medical passes identifying children as displaced dependents needing transport. In their minds, they were not breaking military law, they were rewriting it in the language of mercy, but the American command wasn't the only one watching. The newly formed German welfare offices, struggling to regain control over lost populations, began issuing demands for custody of unregistered children. They feared that these adoptions blurred the lines between conqueror and conquered, between reconstruction and retribution. The tension built quietly in the background, each side claiming moral authority. What began as individual kindness now carried the weight of international law. Then came Operation Paperweight, the code name whispered among soldiers, for what would become the most daring act of defiance in the post-war occupation. Its origins lay in a single telegram intercepted in May 1947. A sergeant named Robert "Bobby" Klein, stationed near Augsburg, learned that inspectors were scheduled to search his camp within 48 hours. Klein had been sheltering 3 children for nearly a year, siblings whose parents had perished in Dresden. They slept behind canvas partitions in a supply tent, hidden among crates of surplus ammunition. Klein knew that if discovered, they'd be taken to a state orphanage. And he knew what those orphanages looked like. Gray barracks filled with malnourished ghosts at SO. Klein radioed a friend at a nearby airfield. The plan was reckless. Move the children under cover of night, smuggle them aboard a returning transport plane listed for supply retrieval, and send them to an American base in France where oversight was looser. It required coordination from pilots, medics, clerks, and guards, each risking their careers. At 0200 hours, a convoy of 3 trucks rolled out, headlights dimmed. The children slept under tarps in the back, unaware of the danger. By dawn, they were airborne, hidden inside cargo crates marked medical refrigeration units. It worked. For weeks afterward, soldiers across the occupation zones whispered about the Augsburg Run, a successful rescue operation carried out entirely by men who, only 2 years earlier, had fought to destroy the same nation. And though Operation Paperweight was never officially recorded, it became the symbolic heart of a growing underground movement. Meanwhile, American social workers and Red Cross nurses stationed in Europe began documenting these cases in secret. Their field journals described both the emotional toll and the logistical brilliance of what was unfolding. A nurse in Stuttgart wrote of a child named Anna, who refused to sleep indoors after months in ruins, until a corporal built her a makeshift bed from parachute silk and ration boxes. Another entry told of an engineer in Bremen who installed a heating coil from an old Sherman tank engine to warm a children's dormitory. Every solution carried the ingenuity of wartime minds repurposed for peace. These small technical miracles, jury-rigged heaters, hidden compartments, rewired radios, were the quiet backbone of a vast humanitarian rebellion. And as the year drew on, the American media began to take notice. Photographs of soldiers cradling children appeared in Life magazine. One image, taken in Frankfurt, showed a GI kneeling beside a blond boy, feeding him from a mess tin. The caption read, "Enemy no more." The story went viral across America's post-war conscience. Letters flooded the War Department demanding leniency. Politicians began to sense the shift. Under mounting public pressure, the Army hesitated. Commanders debated whether enforcing punishment would destroy morale among men who had already endured years of combat. Many officers, veterans of the European front themselves, quietly sympathized. They knew what it meant to watch a child starve among the ruins they had helped create. Official investigations stalled. Files were misplaced. Reports went unanswered. In the chaos of reconstruction, bureaucracy itself became an unlikely ally. Yet not everyone was pleased. British and French occupation. Officials criticized what they called American sentimentalism. They argued that mixing soldiers with local orphans blurred the moral boundaries of occupation and risked, undermining post-war authority. The Soviets mocked it openly, calling it an imperialist act of adoption propaganda. But the soldiers didn't care. For them, this wasn't politics, it was redemption. In late 1947, one event crystallized the growing movement. During a severe winter storm near Kassel, an army transport column found a group of 30 war orphans trapped in an abandoned rail tunnel. Temperatures had dropped below freezing. Snow blocked both ends of the tunnel. The commanding officer, Captain Thomas Wade, ignored orders to continue his mission and instead organized a rescue using half his fuel supply. For 12 hours, his men hauled children through waist-deep snow, wrapping them in field jackets and warming them beside Jeep engines. 2 soldiers suffered frostbite. None of the children died. When news of Wade's defiance reached headquarters, he expected punishment. Instead, the incident was quietly buried. A colonel told him privately, "You did the right thing, Captain. Let's pretend this never happened." The silence was its own form of approval. By 1948, the adoptions that had begun in secrecy were becoming formalized. American courts, flooded with petitions from returning veterans, began to process cases previously considered impossible. Legal loopholes were exploited. Orphans were reclassified as displaced European dependents or stateless minors. In some instances, sympathetic judges expedited citizenship documents with little more than an affidavit and a photograph. What had begun as an underground movement was slowly becoming legitimate. Still, thousands of stories never made it into any archive. Children who vanished into America under new names. Soldiers who carried their guilt in silence. And engineers, nurses, and clerks who built an invisible bridge between 2 enemy nations. It wasn't an operation planned by generals or signed by presidents. It was engineered by men who refused to obey cruelty. But before the movement could become recognized, a final confrontation loomed. A directive from Washington arrived in the summer of 1948, ordering an end to all unauthorized custodial arrangements. It threatened court-martial for any soldier still harboring unregistered dependents. For those who had risked everything, it felt like betrayal. This time, they would not hide. A handful of soldiers prepared to challenge the order openly. They would take their adopted children, march into the press offices of Frankfurt, and force the story into the public eye. It would be the first time the American Army faced moral defiance not in battle, but from within its own ranks. And when those soldiers stepped forward, cameras flashing, one question would reverberate from the rubble of Germany to the quiet towns of the United States. Who, in the aftermath of total war, truly deserves to be called family? On the morning of July 9, 1948, the air inside the U.S. Press Center in Frankfurt was heavy with cigarette smoke and anticipation. Reporters from across the Allied zones gathered, unaware they were about to witness a confrontation that would redefine what victory meant in post-war Europe. When the doors opened, a line of American soldiers entered, not in formation, not in uniform perfection, but carrying children in their arms. Small hands clutched at khaki jackets. Some wore patched clothes, others tiny army caps. Cameras clicked. Flashbulbs exploded. A sergeant stepped forward and said simply, "We fought to protect the innocent. We will not abandon them now." The silence that followed rippled across continents. Within days, newspapers printed the photographs with headlines that stunned the public. American soldiers defy orders to keep German war orphans. The story spread faster than any military communique ever could. In the towns of Kansas, Ohio, and Texas, families gathered around breakfast tables, staring at images of men once hardened by combat, now shielding the children of their former enemies. Letters poured into Congress. For the first time since the war's end, compassion, not destruction, dominated the headlines. In Washington, debate raged. Some officials warned that legitimizing these adoptions would create a precedent dangerous for future occupations. Others saw in them an opportunity for reconciliation, a moral victory that could heal the wounds of the European battlefield. Behind closed doors, the White House received cables from generals who, despite public silence, quietly supported the men. One general wrote, "Discipline wins wars, but mercy wins peace." The tide was turning. By late 1948, new legal pathways emerged. Under immense public pressure, The Displaced Persons Act was amended to allow the adoption of foreign orphans, including those from Germany. It required complex screening, but for hundreds of soldiers, it meant one thing: their families could finally be recognized. Across Europe, Army lawyers worked alongside welfare officers to formalize custody papers retroactively. For many of these children, their names were rewritten and their nationalities reassigned. What began as an act of defiance became the quiet birth of a new kind of family, one that crossed not only borders but also ideologies. Yet the story's legacy went far beyond individual lives. The movement reshaped the moral identity of post-war America. Soldiers returned home not only as victors, but also as fathers and guardians. Their presence in small-town America forced neighbors to confront uncomfortable questions. Could love erase enmity? Could compassion survive propaganda? Some families faced suspicion. Others became symbols of redemption. Veterans who had once been haunted by the blood of their enemies now found solace in raising their children. The war had taken their innocence. Fatherhood gave it back. In Europe, the psychological impact was profound. German civilians who had lived under the weight of collective guilt began to see another side of the occupiers. To them, these adoptions were not just humanitarian gestures. They were acts of forgiveness carved out of ruin. In the ruins of Kassel and Munich, whispers spread that the Americans are giving back what the war took. Local mayors began working quietly with U.S. welfare officers to identify abandoned children who might be eligible for adoption. The image of the American soldier shifted from conqueror to protector, reshaping public perception of the occupation itself. The soldier's defiance also changed military policy. Within the Pentagon, the incident forced a re-evaluation of how armies managed civilian crises after major conflicts. It was no longer enough to win battles. Armies had to win the peace. Psychologists within the Veterans Administration began studying the mental health of returning soldiers who had taken part in the adoptions. They found something remarkable: lower rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms compared to peers. The presence of a dependent, especially a rescued child, gave many veterans a renewed sense of purpose. Caring for life, it seemed, had helped them forget death. Engineers, nurses, and field clerks who had once been part of the secret networks were quietly commended in internal memos. Some received humanitarian service medals years later, though their true stories remained classified. One technician, who had rewired Army radios to warn soldiers of approaching inspectors, later joined the newly founded UNICEF mission in Germany, using his skills to set up relief communication lines. The movement had bred a generation of veterans who, instead of returning to industry or trade, turned towards service: aid workers, teachers, and volunteers. From the machinery of war, a network of peace builders emerged. But even amid the triumph, there were stories left unresolved. Not every child found a home. Thousands remained in refugee camps until the 1950s, their identities lost among burned archives. Some of the adopted children, once grown, began searching for their origins. In quiet living rooms across America, confessions unfolded. "You were born in Frankfurt," some parents would say, their voices trembling. "We brought you here because we couldn't leave you behind." For many, the revelation brought both gratitude and grief, a collision of two histories inside one life. In Germany, social workers began compiling records of transferred minors. It was the first attempt to document what had happened. Many entries contained only fragments. Male, for years old, no known family, last seen with American unit near Bremen. Others bore small photographs taped beside fading typewritten notes. Those incomplete records, rediscovered decades later, became the foundation of what historians now call the Compassion Corridor, the unrecorded migration of hundreds of German war orphans to the United States under military protection, by the 1960s. The children of those adoptions had grown up. Some enlisted in the same army their adoptive fathers had served, returning to Germany not as refugees, but as Americans. Standing on the same soil where they had once scavenged for food, they saluted the same flag that had once occupied their homeland. It was a cycle of reconciliation. Few could have imagined in 1945. Their presence bridged a cultural divide that no treaty could have sealed. The story also carried deep moral weight. Inside the military's institutional memory. At the Army War College, Case studies of the Frankfurt incident, as it came to be known, were used to teach new officers about ethical leadership in post-conflict zones. The message was clear: authority is hollow without empathy. Commanders were reminded that rules may preserve order, but compassion preserves humanity. Future operations, from Korea to Kosovo, quietly bore the imprint of those lessons. In broader history, the episode stands as one of the most overlooked humanitarian efforts of the 20th century. It wasn't funded by governments or planned by diplomats. It was built by ordinary soldiers, engineers, and nurses who refused to let victory turn to indifference. It demonstrated that even in the aftermath of total war, the smallest gestures could rewrite global perceptions. And though no official monument stands for them, their legacy lives in the quiet lives they saved. Some of those adopted children later reunited with surviving German relatives. Others never found the truth of their birth, but all carried within them the same paradox. They were both the children of Germany and the sons and daughters of America, born in ruins, raised in redemption. They symbolized something far greater than paperwork or policy. They were living proof that compassion could cross even the most unbridgeable divides. As decades passed, their stories surfaced again in memoirs and documentaries. An old photograph, an American soldier holding a child amid rubble, became an enduring symbol of hope. Museums displayed it without captions because none were needed. The image spoke for itself, that after the bombs stopped falling, something far stronger than hatred had taken root. In the end, history often remembers wars for their destruction. But here, the victory was measured not in conquered ground or surrendered armies, but in the quiet heartbeat of a child carried across an ocean. The war that tore the world apart had birthed a generation determined to stitch it back together, one act of mercy at a time. And in the words of one aging veteran, spoken years later at a reunion of the Third Army, "We built weapons to end the war. But in the end, it was love that ended the enemy."